after we got acquired, Walmart basically had every single tool in existence, enterprise licenses. It made me think that maybe tools aren't the answer always, and it's more like how you use the tools. Browser extensions are huge, and Google, Mozilla, all these organizations controlling the browsers, they try to do a good job of patrolling the extension marketplaces, but inevitably, just with anything in security, you get typo squatting. These extensions, they also, a lot of times when you install them, they say the extension will have access to the entire web page. And so what does that allow for? Data exfiltration, some amount of spying. There's also this kind of misconception that there's a million open security roles, which is not true. It's very hard to find a job in security. It's more like people aren't willing to take a chance on junior people. I think that's our biggest risk, because in kind of like what happened with COBOL, you had all these people that just stuck with COBOL. They didn't really train any juniors. Juniors didn't want to get into it. And now they're all retiring. And now what are those big banks going to do, right? They're kind of in really tough positions.
Hi, Kevin. Welcome to Be Fearless podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Yeah, thank you, Sasha. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I just want to give a brief introduction of you to our listeners. So we all know that cybersecurity, security journeys are not linear. Many people come from different backgrounds, military audits, whatever you think of. And I think Kevin is a great example of that non-linear journey. And you worked across startups, massive enterprises, and you pivoted to startup ecosystem, where right now you're staff security engineer at Shiftsmart, and you're actually the first security hire. So super excited to talk about this, how you ended up where you are today. But maybe before we jump into today, we can talk a little bit more about your past. How did you start your cybersecurity journey, and what was the spark that led you there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my path wasn't super typical, but also maybe not the most interesting. Maybe some people will find it interesting. So when I went to college, right, and the rest of the world might be called university, I thought I was going to be a software engineer. So I always liked computers growing up, and software engineering in the US at least was a pretty stable, or was stable, high-paying job. But the advent of AI, maybe not so much anymore. So I did a bunch of internships in college, and then I think by the third one, I realized I wasn't very good at writing code. And so senior year, I kind of had to pivot. And what a lot of people do in college is they go into consulting, management consulting, Big Four. It's kind of the job you take almost as a gap year when you don't know what you're doing in life. And so when I applied to that, it was just general opening, and I happened to be placed in the security group, which at the time was generating a lot of revenue. They were hiring a bunch of people. And so this happened by accident. I thought at the time I was never going to work in tech again after my final internship. That's when I learned never say never. And I think that I did pretty well in that consulting gig. Compared to a lot of my peers, I knew how to code. I knew how to use computers relatively well. So networking and things like that came very naturally. Pet testing wasn't as challenging as for some others who had never written a piece of code in their life. So I decided it made sense to stay in this field. It's still paid well, and I didn't have to write as much code as I originally thought. And I think it was also a kind of a good hybrid of business issues as well. So rather than just writing code all day, a lot of the work you do in security is dependent on your organization. Something we might touch upon later is you can't fix everything. And so one of the skills that successful security folks learn is how to prioritize, how to figure out what actually matters. And a lot of times you're kind of on your own, and you have to figure out the answer yourself. It's not like you have a PM that just says, hey, here's a couple of tasks in a Jira board, go figure it out. So that's how I got here. Been in the tech side of things ever since, after leaving consulting. So yeah.
Yeah, what an interesting journey. And it looked like if it wasn't for the fact that that part of consulting required more cyber professionals, maybe you would have never ended up where you are today if they just didn't have more budgets. That's super interesting. But then I wonder, I know that you said that you didn't like to write code that much, but then you ended up being in the field that required a bit of it. Do you think it's still the case today where a lot of people that are looking to enter the space, do they still need to do that? Or do you think it's you see it less and less?
Yeah, it's a good question. So these days, with the advent of Cursor, Windsurf, and some of these coding assistants, it definitely makes it easier. So, I mean, I use Cursor every day. I don't like doing things from scratch. It's one of the more tedious parts of being in tech. I think since security has always been very hard to break into, these days there's even more competition, so many resources to learn, and there's fewer and fewer spots for entry-level folks. So I feel like, if anything, being some amount of a software engineer probably helps you. So there's a lot of kind of podcasts and talks from folks who want people to get into the industry. And one of the themes is, you don't need to be technical to get into security. While that may be true, it doesn't hurt. So like my perspective is a little different because I've always been early security hire, jack of all trades. And part of it is you have to have some understanding of AppSec. You can't just be a pure non-technical person as the first security hire, because half the time you tell devs like, hey, things are broken. And they go, great, you go fix it. We don't have time, right? And so by not having that coding background, I think you put yourself at a pretty big disadvantage. Especially because AI can do a lot of the menial tasks. And so you're kind of left doing the higher level things like identifying patterns in AppSec, maybe not writing the code yourself, but telling devs, hey, here are the big overarching problems that we have. And so if you're not a big computer person, that's going to be hard to learn and pick up, right?
Yeah. So in a way, having this ability to look at the bigger picture, and do I understand it correctly, it's not quite possible to look at the bigger picture if you don't understand the depth that is involved into this.
Even things like planning level of effort, if you're a CISO, it helps a lot if you have written code before. So that if you're telling your team to do things, you have a rough understanding of how long it'll take, right? So something like a cross-site scripting attack, on the surface, you might think, oh, it's like a 2-line code of change based on this pen test report. But if you're not familiar with your code base, you might not realize there's all these other dependencies. People have to test, right? Unit tests have to be fixed. Sometimes that same bug is found throughout the code base. So your devs actually need to fix it in multiple places. And so by never have been in the trenches yourself, it's kind of hard. And I think that's where a lot of conflicts come in. I saw this a lot in consulting, where it was mostly non-technical folks. So a lot of people in consulting are career consultants. They've always been kind of like project managers. They give recommendations very infrequently. Do Big Four folks do implementation? And so they kind of tell the client like, hey, do this. And then they come back next year and they're like, why is everything still broken? Most of it is because things are hard to fix, right? And so if you've never done that yourself, it's kind of hard to understand like just how hard it is to fix things, especially at legacy big enterprises. Like being in tech, things move a lot faster, but the bigger you get, things tend to slow down. The harder it is to get things like security, which are not seen as revenue generating, kind of in place. And it's just kind of like an endless cycle. So having a mix of the soft skills plus technical, I think, helps people get ahead.
Yeah. And I know that with a lot of consultants or friends of mine, whenever they are looking to, let's say, shift to more operational role, they're like, okay, all the advice that I'm giving, it actually has to be implemented now. And this becomes a harder challenge. But I know that you mentioned that you were first cybersecurity hire in quite a few places. How did this whole, journey start from? I'm sure it was easier to become first hire in many places, but what was the first place that sort of set that starting point for you?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say when I first joined Jed, it was an e-com company acquired by Walmart. Technically was the second security hire. The first hire, he just had a bunch of health issues. So a lot of the time I was just left to my own devices. I was 23 at the time, 2 years out of college, had no idea what I was doing. And we had a lot of incidents. It was a pretty new environment, but we had a lot of traffic. We were somewhat of a big name. There was a big marketing budget. So at least in the US at the time, a lot of people knew what Jet was. We had a big bug bounty. We also had to do due diligence because we got acquired about a year into my tenure there. And so I think just the kind of combination of all these things that maybe aren't super typical, it kind of helped me accelerate the jack of all trades knowledge. And so since we were a fairly small team in the beginning, we had a managed SOC, right? We had a massive budget for what it was worth. And so my manager, who wasn't a security person, bought a ton of tools from the guidance of one of the VCs they hired. And the whole thing was, okay, we have a ton of tools. If we don't use them, finance is going to take our budget away. And so I kind of just forced myself to learn everything. Like we had a IDS, we had to implement EDR, we had to implement MDM, we had a WAF, we had DDoS protection, we were early Azure Security Center customer. So it was kind of the opposite experience where I had at other startups where we had too many tools. And so it was a good experience in that there was just a lot of exposure. And so by the end of it, I just felt like, especially after dealing with PCI, I had kind of touched a little bit of everything. So I felt pretty ready. And so everywhere I've went, I don't think there's been any real surprises because had to deal with legal, had to deal with HR issues, all these things that I didn't expect to do as a 23-year-old. I thought I was just going to do some AppSec stuff for a couple of years, and it ended up being a mix of everything. Just, again, like kind of by accident, it just happened. And even when our team expanded, we all kind of still kept generalist roles. This is just the nature of security in a lot of cases, right?
Yeah, that's probably the best place to be in, because wherever you decide to go afterwards, you, as you mentioned, you jack of all trades, you can jump into whatever is happening out there, and I'm sure super helpful. How many tools were you handling at that time? It's probably, as you said, it's not the typical startup case to have so many tools in place.
Yeah, like it was a lot. Like Splunk, we used as our SIM. Darktrace was our IDS. We used a combination of Bit9 and Symantec as EDR. We were doing application whitelisting before Bit9 kind of decided it was a bad idea. We had BugCrowd as our bug bounty. So not really a tool, but I consider it to kind of be a tool because it solved a lot of AppSec issues. We probably had Veracode at some point. We used Akamai as a WAF. Azure Security Center to kind of do like the cloud security posture management kind of before Wiz came out. Jamf was our MDM. I believe we used Intune for Windows. At one point, we thought about Symantec DLP, and we decided this is a bad idea. The team is too small. We used Palo Alto firewalls back when companies still had physical firewalls. Like a whole lot of things. I'm sure we could have bought more. And I think that's when I started to realize after we got acquired, Walmart basically had every single tool in existence, enterprise licenses. It made me think that maybe tools aren't the answer always, and it's more like how you use the tools. And so we didn't kind of use all of them in the same way. Some of them we found less important than others, but it's one of those things. We had a budget. We were going to spend it. I've never been in that situation since where we basically had an unlimited budget for tools. Now it's the opposite, right?
That was going to be my next question, was like, as you moved from being second security hire at a company to companies afterwards, if you saw similar pattern where, let's say, you had to handle so many tools, or did you find it actually more helpful to have fewer tools? What changed throughout your journey?
Sure. Yeah, I think as I kind of went on, the budgets got smaller and smaller. But also I started to understand that just buying tools doesn't necessarily solve your problem, and a lot of it is based on your kind of company posture. A good example I can give is SeatGeek. So it was a ticketing company, kind of like Ticketmaster, and the biggest issues we had there were vulnerability management because we had a lot of legacy infrastructure. Things weren't patched, things weren't behind any sort of security groups, right? And so investing in Tenable.io for vulnerability management made a lot of sense because we knew that patching was in bad shape and we wanted to get better at that. But on the flip side of things, we also had a big problem with account takeover because of the nature of ticketing business is ticket brokers, some of their accounts have access to hundreds or millions of dollars of tickets. So we invested in a bot detection tool. Whereas at my current company, it's a gig worker platform. There's not a lot of account takeover. And so like a WAF is sufficient for us based on our volume and kind of attack patterns. But vulnerability management is still a problem, right? It's a fairly old company in tech world. And so knowing things like what to patch, pretty important, but like edge protection, really not that big of a deal. It's not a super household name for better or worse. We don't get a ton of attack traffic. So I'm not going to invest in something like Cloudflare Enterprise Bot Detection because the ROI is not there. And so that's something that I also started having to learn as I kind of got through this is when you're young, you kind of want to fix everything. You see all these security problems. As you get older, you realize fixing security problems costs money, either time or someone's, some budget, right? And finance is not going to say you can fix everything. And also your CTO, CIO, they're also not going to be able to say you can fix everything. They will always ask, what is the most important thing to do this quarter? What is the most important thing to do this year? And I think that's the big difference compared to myself 10 years ago, whereas I used to want every tool. I wanted visibility into everything to fix everything. Now it's more which things will cost the company the most money or which things will help the company make the most money.
Yeah, I think that there is this challenge where today we see more and more threats happening, but at the same time, budgets are still constrained and it's like moving the opposite direction. I wonder, how do you find the balance with all these restraints and at the same time having to secure from so many threats originating from so many vectors?
Sure, that's a good question. I think a lot of it is kind of understanding your organization. So, these days, there are companies like Material Security, Abnormal around like email protection, right? They're getting a lot of traction. So for a company like ours, not a big household name, realistically speaking, at least to my knowledge, knock on wood, we don't get a lot of phishing attacks, right? Sometimes we'll get like the text messages from our CEO, those bogus ones, but relative to other organizations I've been at, it's not really been a big problem. And so for me, it maybe makes less sense to invest in like a email phishing detection solution compared to other things like let's get foundational stuff like EDR in place, MDM in place, let's get a firewall in place, things like that. And so if you're an organization where maybe you have a lot of PII that's super sensitive, like social security numbers, or if your customer support deals a lot with payments, maybe you start investing more into phishing, right? And so I think that's why for any kind of younger folks listening to this, I think the most important thing you can kind of figure out is what is most important for your company, work backwards from there. And so I actually think you should kind of toss all your security best practices aside for a bit and try to focus on the goal of our company is X. How can I ensure the company can keep doing that? And so you can kind of pick out pieces as you go for controls to build out, and you shouldn't just go, this is a good thing to do in security, let me go do it, because then you're not really going to have a direction. It's going to be hard to demonstrate to the board and people like that, like why your investment matters. End of the day, money talks, right? And so if your controls help keep your website up and you're like an e-commerce website, then it makes sense to invest in like an anti-DDoS protection solution, right? But let's say your organization doesn't handle a lot of PII. Does it make a lot of sense to invest in a super expensive DLP that takes 6 months to implement? Probably not, right? So I think it's very industry organization specific.
Yeah, and that makes sense because, as you said, budgets are limited. You have to make the wisest decision, and there are a lot of conversations as I speak to heads of security. How do you communicate that ROI, right? How does it translate into revenue? Like the revenue doesn't get cut if we have this tool in place. But when you just joined Shiftsmart, I wonder what kind of things did you do immediately, like regarding the security program or anything that you thought, okay, this is something that I want to focus on?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I was kind of told in the beginning, like, kind of do what you can. and don't ask for a ton of money, which is very normal, right? And so if you join an organization, historically there's not been security. The first thing you're probably going to want to look at is access control. And so when a company is just 3 or 4 people, everyone has admin access to everything. But as you grow, people still get admin access to everything. And so based on kind of conversations with peers, a lot of times the issues they run into is just some account was compromised and person stopped using some tool, or they had too many permissions. And so real easy, low-hanging fruit is just do a user access review of all your important tools, get a sense of who has access to what, a couple of side effects that also help you when you're new to an organization is as you do your user access review, you can also probably figure out that for these SaaS tools where licenses cost money, people stop using tools after a while. And so you can actually tell finance like, hey, I did this whole review. We're actually going to be able to save a few $1,000s a month because all these people stop using this thing. So you get some brownie points with finance because you help them save some money. You also help yourself because you start understanding how your organization looks like, what people do, what their roles are. It's a good way to meet people when you do user access reviews because you start asking them like, hey, do you actually need this tool? What do you do? Right. Right. And I think that's probably the most kind of bang for your buck thing that you can do. It doesn't really cost anything in terms of tools. You can kind of just, you don't even have to log into the tools yourself. You can just ask an admin, hey, send me a screenshot, or if it's free, like invite me. And this is probably the easiest thing you can do. If anything, it's like the best thing you can do to save the company money. And kind of what we talked about before, when we talk about ROI, if you as security can definitively say, I saved the company money, that is a big accomplishment because this is super hard to do in our field. And what better way than to say, so-and-so doesn't use this tool anymore. Like, I think that this is a risk because this is like, I don't know, some account that could be compromised and there's not a lot of visibility into it. And the way you justify removing that access is by saying, hey, we can save finance $10 a month, right? And so now it's not just a security problem, it's like a finance problem, and multiple people are getting some benefit out of it, right?
And I'm sure that the bigger organization is more appreciative of these initiatives because they do see it rather than a cost activity of revenue optimization activity when you as a security leader have an understanding of, okay, I'm actually going to invest in something that sort of keeps the budget under control and at the same time doesn't overwhelm the organization.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of the newer kind of SaaS posture management tools, what a lot of their go-to-market strategy is, hey, in addition to helping you identify security issues in your SaaS services, this will also help you with license management. And so now you have a security tool that can actually function as a service for a different department. Also really rare, right? And so the more you can kind of say, this helps more than just security, the better justification you have for these shrinking budgets, right? To squeeze one more line item in. And it also just makes sense for the company, right? So it's wasteful to have all these SaaS licenses lying around. It's a security risk if these are not tied to Okta or anything like that. It's just a username and password. And so everybody wins if you're able to kind of clean that up.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if there are any particular unique security controls that you think companies in B2B2C space should adopt or shouldn't adopt.
Interesting. So maybe not controls, but I think in terms of kind of risk management. So typically B2C companies will have different applications. So some of the applications will be for the B2B enterprise customers. Some will be for the B2C kind of end users. And it's important to realize that the end users on either side, they think about security differently. And so typically for a B2C, the B2C part of it, there's some payments involved, right? And so the number one priority is making sure that those users get paid properly, and also that their accounts don't get taken over and payment methods aren't changed. Like, you don't want someone's balance to be kind of withdrawn. So people are going to care if they lose money. And so a lot of the controls are going to be driven around that. Whereas the B2B side of things, companies are more concerned with like bottom line and PII. And so if anything, like this cyber insurance questionnaires that you even do are going to be a little different because one side of your customer base just wants to know, like, I want to get paid. Realistically, if there's a data breach, I think it just happens so often. You see it all in the news all the time. The regular consumer is very kind of jaded and almost immune to new news. As long as their identity doesn't get stolen and they don't have to get a new credit card, do they particularly care if their email gets leaked? I don't think so. Like, even looking at the stock market, right? Every time there's a big breach, some new organization, maybe they have a temporary dip, and then in a month goes back up. Whereas for B2B, the incentives are different. They sometimes have regulatory requirements they have to abide by, right? And if their third party has some breach, they actually can get fined and punished for it. So now their incentive is, I don't want my third party getting me in trouble, not so much that I don't want my like customer user data being breached. That's still a concern, but the primary problem is some auditor will ask us, like, why are we using this third party? Like, how do we respond? It's just kind of a mess, right? And part of it is you hire some third party to kind of offload some time and make your services a little easier. But if that introduces risk, it creates problems for that org. And so you kind of have to design controls that satisfy both parties, which is interesting. And so if you're kind of like a jack of all trades type of person, you've been at different organizations, it definitely helps. And so you kind of have to design both your apps with different threat profiles, because your B2B apps probably going to have like SSO, right? And so account takeover is going to be less of a problem. And so maybe you're more focused on like infrastructure controls, and like access controls internally. The B2C side of things, account takeover, bot detection is also going to be something you factor in. And you also don't have the luxury of 2FA. So most consumer apps really can't enforce 2FA, or they make it optional, whereas B2B, your customers actually want it. And so you almost have like an easier time, right? So you kind of have to build controls for everybody, which can be challenging. But the good thing is most of these apps are not for both audiences. You can usually kind of divide it, have a different threat model for each. But yeah, it's not easy. And the good thing is, for anyone who wants to be kind of first security hire, if you join an organization where you have to cater to both, then it helps you in your future career. You're kind of ready for both directions, right?
Yeah, pretty much. You can be thrown into any water and you already know how to swim. And I think they're very, like, there are so many differences between B2B versus B2C security controls. One example that comes to mind when I was speaking to Sid Trivedi from Foundation Capital was the CrowdStrike incident probably is the one that united both audiences, because even B2C was like, okay, what is CrowdStrike? What just happened? But there aren't that many examples. I don't know. What's your take? Was there any particular example that you think united both audiences?
Yeah. I think when you talk about open source software, so whether you're a B2B or B2C, the underlying application, you're probably going to use a bunch of open source dependencies. Like Log4j was an example, right? So a lot of companies in both situations use that as part of their tooling, and everybody had to patch. This was one of those things where, even though the end consumer may not care a ton, you still have this thing that basically allows for like the CVSS score was 10. And so everybody had to patch that. That was a big issue. Right now, another current problem that people are dealing with is job applicants that maybe are not who they say they are, right? And so you probably don't want somebody who has access to a lot of B2C, like kind of consumer data to not be who they say they are, right? And so I think all security people right now are thinking about, how can we combat the job applicant thing? And the easiest solution is bring them in for a in-person interview, right? But not every company can do that. That's something I can think of.
Yeah, job applicants is a great example. It makes me think of, there are so many applications happening by LinkedIn or any other similar platforms, and a lot of these attacks taking place on the browser. I wonder what's your attitude towards browser security, as we see more like this is the attack vector that is leveraged more and more by attackers.
Sure. Browser security in the sense that people are exploiting 0 days and all that stuff.
0 days, or just in general, browser becoming the window for attackers to execute whatever they wanted to execute.
Yeah, I think in this day and age, compared to maybe 20 years ago, browser extensions are huge. And, Google, Mozilla, all these the organizations controlling the browsers, they try to do a good job of patrolling the extension marketplaces, but inevitably, just with anything in security, you get typo squatting, right? And so a lot of people like to install Honey, the app for finding coupon codes, but there's a bunch of kind of mock fake Honey-like extensions that say, oh, we will autofill coupon codes for you. It'll be more effective than Honey. And what it is these extensions, they also, a lot of times when you install them, they say the extension will have access to the entire web page. And so what does that allow for? Data exfiltration, some amount of spying. And it's the same problem that we've always had is end user is not going to be the end-all, know-all security person. And so what a lot of organizations are doing is they're investing in things like secure browsers, right? We saw Talon, Island. These are browsers where things are kind of sandboxed in this secure environment. It's harder to break out. Extensions are tightly controlled. And what I've also seen is a lot of companies more in the finance space, highly regulated, they've started using VDIs, right? And so they learned during COVID, hey, everybody's going to be working from home. We really can't trust whatever's on their network or even the endpoint. So for a lot of developers, what they do is they straight up log into some virtual desktop that exists somewhere else. And the idea is if something is happening locally on their laptop, the VDI kind of isolates everything and it kind of, contains yourself from what typical usage will kind of open things up to. Especially during COVID, people were at home, that they were doing personal things on their laptop. One client I helped with on her work computer, she was dealing with a wine order, a bulk one for an upcoming party. And so the wine shop, their email got compromised, and then some attacker sent out emails from that email and what they did was they found a list of all the people at upcoming orders. They basically said, hey, here's a fake invoice, right, for your upcoming order. And that one, what was it? It was a exploit for people who didn't update to a version of Chrome that had just come out. And what it did was it took all the passwords in Chrome Password Manager, because everyone just hits, save password, right? And then it started logging into all the different websites. And she, of course, didn't have 2FA on. And so, that was one thing that could have been easily avoided, maybe. They had CrowdStrike on, they had EDR on, they had a policy that said, don't do anything personal on your laptop unless you start clamping down with things like Palo Alto's where you block out certain categories, or if you have Netscope where you can block out specific Gmail. I think these are things you kind of just assume will happen. And so, but to that company's kind of credit is their risk posture wasn't the situation where they were going to get phished a lot, right? This was something that happened to our personal email. Once in 10 years, they had this happen. And so it's not a case of you should always buy this because there's a possibility. And for them, ended up not being a big deal because most of the usernames and passwords she had were for her personal accounts. All of the kind of business ones that they had, they were able to disable that account, kind of stop the damage. But yeah, that was a very common attack path that I think a lot of people have. And so things that can, maybe help with browser-based attacks, I think will stay relevant. Things like Island and Talon, they're not cheap. Most companies are not going to pay for a specific browser, especially because if your CEO is I want to be able to go on Facebook on my work computer, what are you going to tell them? No, I don't think that's really realistic. But maybe you can tell them hey, we're going to invest in some solution that is maybe also an extension or something that will kind of help monitor for other bad extension behavior. That makes a little more sense. It's a better balance.
Yeah, I really love the example that you brought up, because I think this is the kind of example that would work whether someone is super cybersecurity aware or not really security aware, because you don't really expect anything bad happening. like it's just an voice that she received, right? So it doesn't like automatically trigger anything bad. So it's a great example. And even though it happened once in 10 years, I mean, right now, this attack's just starting becoming more serious and serious. And maybe this once in 10 years is going to become once in 5, and then once in 3, and then once in, I don't know, every single day. So I think browser extensions are extremely powerful. I see a lot of examples of Gemini extensions as well, where people like, oh, why do I bother paying for a paid version of ChatGPT when this one is just comes free?
Right. I think the solution for that is, instead of trying to combat people and resisting, so I was one of those AI skeptics 2 years ago. What makes more sense is, rather than allowing people to potentially download those weird ones, just pay for whatever enterprise, ChatGPT Enterprise or something like that. You know they're going to use it. At the very least, if you pay for it, you have some sort of enterprise agreement where if there is some sort of security incident, you have some sort of recourse. And also, if you pay for it, you can also tell these people, like, hey, we have the paid version. It's going to work a lot faster than the free one that you're used to. And then with the paid version, you can start connecting it to things like your Google Drive and whatnot, and then it'll have more context. And so, again, this is one of those things where everybody kind of wins. So security feels a little better that they have the paid version, because you can also connect it to Okta, right, for login. And the end user has a better experience. They don't have to go on a whim and kind of find their own thing. And so these are the things that help security folks in the long run, when you can try to find tools that help everybody else. It's not super easy, but when it happens, it's a much better experience than, like, you know, like no one says, oh, thank you so much for installing CrowdStrike on my laptop, right? But if you sign up for ChatGPT Enterprise, they'll say, oh, we have an enterprise license. Great. You know?
No, this definitely helps. Maybe the only thing was, that comes to mind is, if, let's say, you now have enterprise version, which works a lot better, but then you want to ask some random dumb questions that, let's say, you don't want your enterprise to see, then this challenge sort of comes back, because you're like, oh, okay. And then it's just limiting your personal ChatGPT use case.
It is possible. And then at that point, you're back to the same problem, right? Of like, are people going to do weird things on your computer? And so if you care a lot about it, then you can do things like install Netscope, decrypt all their traffic, and you can kind of intercept bad things from happening. But I think most organizations are not going to go that far. And so it is something that you kind of just accept. And so part of it is just train people on using AI effectively and in a good manner. And maybe you start to reduce the risk of people doing stupid things, right?
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, personal and work life become so interlinked that you just have to be agile enough to make sure that you don't really get on people's toes when it comes to personal side, but also, staying safe on the professional side. I want to ask you some questions on more leadership perspective.
Sure.
How do you stay current with the threats and security trends when you're wearing multiple hats and don't have the luxury of dedicated research time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I like to stay up to date by meeting founders in the space. And so something you'll learn about security is people are always trying to make money, right, from our field. And there's so many new threats, so many new attack vectors. And sometimes before you even learn about something, there's some startup founded by former Israeli military that's been tackling this problem for 2 years, right? And so this is one way where people come to me and they say, hey, here's this thing that I think is a problem. Do you want to give some product feedback? I really like doing it. So this is how SafeBase, my previous startup, kind of got really big. Was we just reached out to a bunch of CISOs. We would always say, hey, this is not a sales call. We want to see if you like this idea of a trust center, right? And so this is kind of my way of giving back in a way. Like I want to help founders with like ideation and things like that, because I feel like vendors, whether we like it or not, are partners for us, and they're how we can solve a lot of problems. You generally can't run a good security org without external tools. And so this is kind of how I figure out what's going on. Like before ChatGPT even got big, right? All the prompt security tools were already in production with design partners. And so stuff like that happens a lot earlier than people realize. And you'll see a lot of founders are in stealth mode, right? They're working on some idea that you'll probably think is a problem in 2 years. And their whole thing is they need to be like first to market and ready to go. So the problems that we're encountering right now around like AI security, there have been organizations working on this for 4 or 5 years. You just may not have realized it, right?
Yeah. Before you even thought of the problem, probably already someone is working with started working it 5 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yesterday, I went to a dinner hosted by one of the big AI security platforms. And when we were doing introductions, I think the solutions engineer was like, "Oh yeah, I've been at this company for more than 3 years now." And I was like, wait, that's ChatGPT only came out in 2023. So they were kind of in the know. They were already aware that this was going to happen, right? If VCs can make money, they will find somebody to go build something to make money for them. So it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's sort of like insider information that you get exposed to when
in a lot of ways. Yeah. Like the new trend that we're going to start to see right now, it's not super big yet, is like the AI AppSec engineer. And so AppSec has been something that historically has been very hard to automate, but with Gen AI and like context and all that, in 2 or 3 years, we're going to see more and more AppSec assistants that help with pen tests. This was something maybe 5 years ago, everyone was always very skeptical and said, the most you could do is infrastructure network pen test. Like this computer program can't really learn business context. That's already starting to change, right?
Yeah, but it's exciting times to be in. But at the same time, going back to your background, like while there's so much of adoption of AI, you also have to stay grounded with the fundamentals, because if you're just gonna outsource everything to AI, maybe you're even gonna forget how to prompt it in the right way.
Third-party risk management, it's the same thing as before. It's you have to evaluate if some new AI tool is introducing risk into your environment. So you do the same due diligence. You ask some questions like, what data are you processing? Do you have your SOC 2 in place? These days, you might ask for like an AI red team exercise to be done, maybe instead of a traditional web app pen test. But the foundations are still there. You shouldn't blindly allow your organization to adopt AI tools without some due diligence. So that's kind of why I mentioned go for the paid plan of whatever AI tool rather than leaving people to do whatever they want. Stuff like input validation is the same thing, right? We're starting to see guardrail tools that kind of control what people can do. Prompt engineering security, is it really that different from traditional input validation? The techniques may be a little different, but the core foundation is if a user sends you some input, there should be cases where you reject that input or you kind of tell the user, we don't process it, things like that, like what we talked about before, right? And so security foundations are still a thing. And I think a lot of organizations are jumping on the AI security train when they still have problems, like some of their laptops are still not encrypted or they're not patching, right? And so before you dive too deep into that, I think just remember you still have a lot of regular security problems and kind of extend the same techniques you have to AI, and I think that's the best way to approach it at the moment.
Definitely. What's one piece of advice that you received early in your career that turned out to be completely wrong when you applied to startup security?
It turned out to be completely wrong. I think one of my early coworkers, he was very much of we should raise alarms and make things like super visible, and because we need to make sure like people feel like we're in control and that we know what we're doing. And these days, whenever there are security incidents, I've taken the opposite approach. So I found that doing like a @ here in Slack causes panic, distracts people. And so a lot of times when you're dealing with an incident, you're not even sure if it's like a true positive yet. And so my advice these days is for people dealing with incidents is kind of keep the initial response team small. Because the moment you start to bring in other people, you may start to regret it. I think like legal is a good example. Maybe don't involve legal until you're somewhat sure that maybe PII is leaked, because now things start to change and there's things like client attorney privilege and maybe things that you say you can't be like free flowing anymore when like a lawyer's in the room. So I think that was one thing that I've started to change. I don't like scream to the whole company like, "Hey, we have a breach," maybe like I would have 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's back to the question of resources, right? Whether it's a budget or resources, you have to be mindful of all of that, and just being able to pick the right thing in all this noise of information. So we have this little tradition, Kevin, on our podcast where typically our last guest would ask question to the next guest. So our previous guest asked you, what's the most overlooked cybersecurity risk today that we have not seen or will become very critical in the next 3 to 5 years? That it could be due to AI evolution or due to something totally different.
Sure. Yeah, I think we've always had a problem with building teams out. And so one thing that I like to do is I like to talk about getting into entry-level security all the time. And I feel like ever since I started, it's still extremely hard for a junior person to break in. And I think the solution is to hire more people and to get more people into our field. To this day, we still see all these job descriptions for like an entry-level SOC analyst. It'll say things like, you need a master's degree, you need like 10 different certifications, you need to have prior experience, even though it's an entry-level role. And so there are these security people that they think they're better than everybody else and that they only want to hire the best of the best. And so at some point, that doesn't really scale. And you do need to hire junior people to do things that maybe don't require as much experience. And some people are saying, oh, AI is going to replace a lot of these junior tasks. Maybe, but then at that point, who is going to train the people who eventually will become like very senior, right? And so I think the biggest risk is still a people problem. It's not that there's a lack of talent, right? Which is kind of there's also this kind of misconception that there's a million open security roles, which is not true. It's very hard to find a job in security. It's more like people aren't willing to take a chance on junior people. I think that's our biggest risk, because in kind of like what happened with COBOL, you had all these people that just stuck with COBOL. They didn't really train any juniors. Juniors didn't want to get into it. And now they're all retiring. And now what are those big banks going to do, right? They're kind of in a really tough position. So I think if people like myself, if we don't take on mentees and junior people and teach them and train them in like our thinking, in 20 years, all these people complaining about how the people they interview are bad, they might retire. And then what do those organizations do? Like, how do you get people to even like a mid-level security mindset? I think you just have to take a chance on people.
Yeah. It goes back to the point that today you see attackers literally coming from high school and being able to crack the systems. If you have attackers of that age, why can't you have defenders?
Why can't you do it on the blue team, right?
Yeah.
And so all of us had to start from somewhere. Someone took a chance on us, and most of us weren't hacker prodigies that happen to get noticed. And so I think we all have to keep that in mind when we're doing our hiring and team building. It's the same with software engineers that I work with, right? Usually a company will start off with more senior folks to kind of get their product going, but at some point they're supposed to hire junior engineers to do like smaller tasks, to give more time to the senior folks to do bigger strategy. And I don't think AI will replace all of that, because at some point we all will retire out. So you need to have somebody to take over.
People around us.
Yeah, for sure.
What question would you like to ask to our next guest?
Good question. Yeah. I think my question is, I really like the idea of these fireside chats that they have at security conferences where people talk about issues, breaches that they've had. My kind of whole thing is, why do people not do this more? So like the way I've built a lot of my security knowledge is I've learned from my peers who have gone through bad times, right? And a lot of the takeaways that I factor into my kind of personal security philosophy. And a lot of the controls I build are based off of incidents that I've heard of in real life, right? And I feel like a lot of people, when I meet them, they're hesitant to talk about problems that they have internally. And I wonder, like, how are we all going to get better if we don't share information, right? Like, why are these fireside chats limited to 20 people at a conference? Like, is there a way we can open that up so that more people can learn? I'm very open talking about incidents that I've had in the past, and what my old employer is going to sue me. It was from like 5-6 years ago. And I feel like whenever I do that, people are like, wow, okay, cool. And so, yeah, why don't we do that more? I think it's not common enough.
Yeah, it's definitely not common enough. I mean, it is already good to see so many companies publicly sharing, let's say once a breach happens. Before it wasn't that big of a trend.
Right. 20 years ago, they would never do that ever. Now we're slowly doing it, but it's still not enough, I think. We all have so much knowledge and we're not talking to each other. So how can we improve that, I guess, is my question for the next person.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think the goal of this podcast as well is to remove the stigma of talking about topics that used to be taboo, of discussing the incidents and discussing what is the next step that we're supposed to be moving towards. So I'm also really looking forward to answer to this question, whoever is going to be the next guest. So yeah, well, Kevin, it's been such a pleasure having you here with us. It's been such a fun conversation, learning how you got into cybersecurity, what should people do if they want to become a first cybersecurity hire, and, just general, how do you go about adopting different tools, whether you are in a big organization, small organization, you have to take into account so many things. So I think it's going to be very, very valuable to our listeners. And it's been a lot of fun having you here with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.